we can begin. I think we can still see the slides. Sorry, 1 minute. We are just going to. Okay, I think we can start. And so yeah, welcome everyone. I see people are still joining, yeah, thank you very much for joining today. I want to express our gratitude to the panelists who we have with us today and who I will introduce in a minute. We are delighted to have such experienced speakers, and we really look forward to discussion. My name is Katya. I'm a legal officer at Redress. I would start with a few housekeeping notes. So as I was saying, simultaneous interpretation is available in French, Spanish, Arabic, and Ukrainian. So please activate the relevant language at the bottom of your screen. If you have any issues accessing interpretation, let us know in the chat and we can address it. You're also welcome to use closed captions. You can also activate them in the caption feature. Please note that listeners are not able to use the microphone function. You will find a Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to send your questions there. We will have first a moderated discussion, and then you will be able to send your questions in the chat, and the speakers will address them. You're welcome to think about your questions and put them in the chat anytime. Finally, just a note that the webinar is live streamed. This webinar is part of Redress Solidarity Program, which aims to promote the exchange of experiences on strategic litigation, strengthen the global anti-torture movement, and contribute to a community of practice. And today's session will examine a survivor-centered approach to documentation. I will introduce the panelists who will all be discussing their experience with documentation in their respective contexts. We have with us Mohamed Badawi, a human rights officer at the African Center for Justice and Peace Studies. Mohamed is a Sudanese lawyer, and since 2009, he has led the monitoring and documentation of human rights violations in Sudan and works with in-country monitors and advocacy networks. He has trained numerous human rights defenders, previously directed the Annual Center for the Treatment and Rehabilitation of Victims of Torture in North Darfur, and has taught at Al Fashir University. We also have with us Emma Di Napoli, who is an associate legal officer with Eyewitness to Atrocities. Emma joined Eyewitness to Atrocities in 2025, and before she was a lawyer in the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, and also worked in the Office of Amal Clooney and at Redress, where she also worked with partners in Sudan and human rights organizations in Palestine and Lebanon. And finally, we have with us Roger Lou Phillips, legal director at Syria Justice and Accountability Center. Roger manages OSINT and closed source investigative teams at the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. He also oversees legal analysis team, trial monitoring and UJ cases, universal jurisdiction cases. He was previously a legal officer at the UN Assistance to Khmer Rouge Trials and UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So to just open this webinar, as I was saying, all our panelists today and our experts work in different way with survivors. documenting human rights violations and international crimes. And this is reflective of the broader civil society documentation efforts and civil society-led accountability initiatives, which we see many in recent years. Last year, to capture these emerging practices and identify lessons learned related to documentation and, in particular, documentation efforts while working with survivors, Redress, together with partners from International Accountability Platform for Belarus, published a practice note on survivor-centered approach to documentation for the purpose of criminal accountability. The International Accountability Platform for Belarus is a coalition of non-governmental organizations that work together to document human rights violations committed in Belarus in the context of 2020 presidential election. So I would like to speak a little bit about this practice note and what it covers. So our goal was really to capture the lessons learned from this documentation initiative, which conducts documentation both through collecting witness testimonies in person and remotely. It identifies key principles in adopting a survivor-centered approach to documentation of torture and other serious international crimes. Principles are related to several broad categories: relationship with survivors, their representation and accompaniment. And in these three categories, we included principles such as responding to survivors' needs and priorities, do no harm principle, a principle of non-discrimination, dignity and compassion, managing expectations, confidentiality, accountability of documents and organizations to survivors, voluntary and informed participation, and planning for residual functions. We then look at how these principles can be applied at different stages of documentation by civil society for the purpose of criminal accountability and present good practices. So the practice note walks us through different stages, from mapping and identifying survivor communities, making first contact through informed consent and security issues, survivor-centered protocols covering different aspects of documentation, and also engagement with survivors after the active documentation stage. Because as we know, accountability processes can take a very long time after the documentation efforts themselves already ended. And it covers different aspects of documentation that sometimes documents and organizations tend to not necessarily perceive through the lens of survivor-centeredness. For example, what does the sustainability of your documentation initiative have to do with survivor-centered approach, and how to make sure that your long-term planning is survivor-centered? And it also covers protection from secondary trauma for staff of documents and organizations. I see that Grace put the publication in the chat, so you can all access it, and it's published in English, Russian, and Belarusian. We published this practice note to make the knowledge and lessons learned on the survivor-centered approach to documentation available to a broader audience of initiatives engaged in documentation. And it also provides some recommendations how perhaps some of the lessons learned could be adapted to contexts where documents and initiatives don't have a lot of funding and can struggle with implementing some of these principles. I'll stop here, and I hope you can access the practice note, and I hope you can use it in your work and implement some of the insights that we share. And I will now turn to our panelists and address the first question to each of them, which will focus on different aspects of their experience related to documentation and working with survivors. I will start with Mohammed. And my question is, Mohammed, what, in your view, are some of the crucial elements of the survivor-centered approach to documentation when working with contexts characterized by high levels of displacement? I'm not sure. Can you hear Mohammed? No, we cannot hear you.
You.
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Regard to your question, I'm really happy to be a part of this panel, and this is a great experience. Regard to the question, I think we have a long experience in Sudan as we have been witnessing several inside war in Sudan. And my experience actually started with the survivors from the Darfur War 2004. And this experience is accumulated like working with in a front zone with the survivors and those cross borders or at the IDP camps. So there are many challenges, but in fact that also there are an opportunities. As example, when we started working in 2004 within the IDP camps in Darfur, we established the networks within the community itself. And these networks of paralegals help us a lot to come out with a lot of documentation, which is really professional, and encourage some of them also to move ahead and to study law and be lawyers. And some of them, they are human rights defenders after 20 years working with several organizations, and also they are added their experience to that. On the event of 3rd of June in Sudan, as example, because it comes when there is a momentum of revolutions and there are hundreds of youth in Sudan, they are experienced the documentation through the social media, through their move on the yard of the sit down in Sudan, and through the peaceful protest. So we found a ground base for documentation that can be used to enhance the documentation for the such events of violations of human rights law and humanitarian law, international humanitarian law, in a way that it may help in the near future that to lead to accountability. In addition to that, the efforts made by the people of Sudan during the revolution, that they put pressure on the former government at that time to establish at least two investigation committees, first by the Attorney General, and second, an independent committee. All this effort together, it shows that there are some space to move and tackle the challenges and come out with professional documentation.
Thank you, Mohammed. And in your answer, you already touched upon a little bit on the issue of digital documentation, or documentation efforts online. And I will now turn to Emma with a question that targets more specifically this aspect, or like this side of documentation. And Emma, can you highlight what a survey-centered approach means when employing digital documentation tools?
Sure. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, Redress. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be on the panel. So I think there are a couple of core principles to taking a survivor-centered approach to digital documentation. And the first, and this is sort of picking up on what Mohammed has already said, is that the survivor safety is really the priority for us over the value of the evidence. And so I think as a starting point, what we do at Redress as part of a kind of broader training program is to help documenters really think about what they need to gather and whether there are alternative ways to, to gather the information or to evidence something. And the second thing is that we do in this kind of training is also to help people assess their risk and possible mitigation measures. And I think Mohammed has kind of touched on some of those. But then probably the more important thing is also how we've designed the Eyewitness to Atrocities app. And I think the basic principle for us when it was created 10 years ago was that the technology should fit survivors' context to the extent possible and not requiring survivors to fit the technology. So we carried out, this is before my time, but carried out over 4 years of consultations with lawyers, survivors, others to understand really what some of the security risks facing documenters might be in terms of digital documentation. And then also how to build an application, for a phone that could allow people to capture evidence that actually was verifiable, and then, has evidentiary value, and while protecting the identities of documenters. So, I think to the extent possible, the application does really address some of the challenges that documenters may face. But I realize that some of you may actually not know what eyewitness to atrocities is. So I'll just kind of briefly explain it. And so Eyewitness is a free application for use by anybody who has an Android phone. So unfortunately, it's not available on an iPhone or the Apple platform, but it allows documenters to capture footage with embedded metadata. So by that, I mean time, date, and location. And so the footage doesn't need to be geolocated or otherwise verified for kind of great expense, and with specialized tools. So you can download the application on your phone, on the Android phone, and you can use it anonymously. So meaning no email, not your real name, or with a username, that otherwise obscures your identity. Or you can use the application through an MOU. So we do this organizationally, with other NGOs. And documenters can capture footage, which is then uploaded to a secure server that's not accessible to the public, which ensures both that the chain of custody is preserved, so the evidence is more usable in a trial, if there were a trial. But it also has a dual function of ensuring that documenters don't need to keep risky materials on their phones because there's an original copy which is preserved separately. And from our perspective, this is a really key protection measure. So both that sources or documenters aren't easily identifiable and that access to documents is limited only to authorized personnel. And so even where a documenter is capturing information in a really risky situation, they can delete the footage from their phone once it's been uploaded, and then we'll send the footage back in bulk to either them once they're in a safe location or to a colleague who may be, not based in the field. The application also allows you to quickly purge a gallery. So if you anticipate your phone may be searched, you can quickly purge your gallery, or delete the app altogether. And we continue to be in kind of two-way communication with documenters, so that if there is a technology issue or a feature that they like to see, a different kind of icon or whatever it is for the application, we're able to do that too. I don't want to take up too much time, but the last thing I'll say also is that as with any other kind of work, for us, ensuring informed consent when people are using the application is really, really important. So we explain pretty clearly how the application works, how files will be stored, who may see them. So internally on our team, who may see footage a documenter is taking, and what risks might be involved. And we also separately train people on securing informed consent from survivors who actually may be featured in the documentation. So you kind of have two pools of people that are impacted by the kind of work that we do. One is the person taking the footage, but the other is often the subject of that footage. So we train documenters on how to themselves secure meaningfully informed consent, and on respecting how survivors choose to be represented. So, whether that's not being represented at all or their footage can only be used for certain purposes. And I think that's just to emphasize that from our point of view, the survivor should always have a final say in how information is captured about them, or if it's captured at all. And this kind of relates to the point I think about doing no harm and documenting only where you should be documenting, where the information is, there's not an alternative way to capture it. And we work with civil society organizations who have the best sense of what their own priorities are and the priorities of survivors, which I think I'll talk about a little bit later. And of course, I should say also that I'm very happy to answer really technical questions about eyewitness, either here or in a separate conversation. So, you can always reach out about that.
Thank you very much, Emma, for sharing about the work of Eyewitness to Atrocities. And I think that's a really important conversation because a lot of the organizations now use digital documentation tools. And Eyewitness has done some really pioneering work in this field. So thank you. I see we already started receiving some questions in the chat. Just to say that we will address all questions after we have some interventions from speakers. So after the break, I'll ask a second round of questions to speakers, and then I will address all the questions that we are seeing in the chat. I will now turn to Roger. And my question relates to the importance of documentation and applying this surveillance approach to documentation in post-transition contexts, because we know, Roger, that you work in the Syrian context, and even though now Syria had transitioned, the documentation efforts still continue and still remain important. So I wanted to ask you to expand a little bit more on this aspect. Why is it important to continue documentation work now, and what are key lessons related to survivor-centered approach in this context?
Thanks, Katya, and thanks to Redress for inviting me to speak today. Yeah, I should provide that a little bit of context with regard to Syria, because just 2 days ago marked the anniversary of the departure of the Assad government, which had, was an authoritarian government and was abusive of its people. And it was a day that we had hoped for a long time, but no one really saw coming. So that really colors my comments today about documentation. I will speak a bit about survivor-centered documentation, but just some general comments to begin with. So one of the lessons that we learned is that from the Syrian transition is that good preparation is key. So, we cannot predict when a transition may occur, and there will be too much to do when the transition occurs to wait and for that moment to do the planning. So, in our case, SJAC knew the importance of the intelligence branches, these offices where a great majority of the human rights violations either took place or were directed from. Therefore, in 2023 and 2024, we conducted a mapping exercise of the dozens of intelligence branches in Syria. And on December 8th of last year, the Assad government abandoned these locations, leaving huge swaths of documentation available for the first time. Yeah, it was through prior experience and work in documentation that we understood the importance of these documents, because there were orders in there, lists of detainees, essential for any type of transitional justice process. So at that time, SJAC reassigned our documentation teams to enter into these branches and collect and scan as much documentation as possible. And that would be for use in transitional justice and accountability processes. So we're currently analyzing those, developing some artificial intelligence tools in order to help us find specific information, because we have now over 2 million pages of documents from those branches. The second point I'd like to make is that witness accounts must be preserved contemporaneously. So at the time the events happened. During conflict, populations are transitory, and the memories of witnesses will fade over time. So in order to get the best possible information, it needs to be the witness and survivor statements need to be preserved when the events remain fresh in their minds. So it's also possible to err too far in the other direction and to collect information too soon after the events, which can exacerbate re-traumatization. So that's something that we want to avoid. For example, the Sednaya prison in Syria is a notorious site of torture and killing in the country, and it's been sort of a black box, as no information escapes unless prisoners are released or until the prisoners are released. So when this happens, often in waves, the newly released prisoners are bombarded with requests from news organizations, from civil society, and UN entities to obtain information about what's going on in the prisons. So, while these are important endeavors, the prisons are severely traumatized after the release, and interviewing them and re-interviewing them multiple times can cause unnecessary re-traumatization. So, we have taken the view at SJAC that we need to allow some time to pass first before we interview former prisoners, allow them to readjust to life, and then we can approach them to conduct interviews at that time. And the second thing that we do is we have a hard rule that we will not re-interview witnesses who have been interviewed previously. So that is amongst the first questions that we ask of survivors. Has another organization, has the UN interviewed you? And if they have, then we don't conduct an interview. And this is for respect out of the survivor and allowing them agency. And also, we may lose some documentation value. We may lose certain interviews and information, but that other information should be in the hands of another organization that can make good use of it. So we think the balance is correct there. And then, sorry, I'm a little long on time, but the third point I'll make is that significant work can be accomplished with open sources, which can counter false narratives. So, responses of perpetrators to allegations against them are predictable. We've seen it many different tribunals or within the public media sphere that they're making similar arguments. They'll make an argument that war crimes are the work of rogue elements, for example, and not their own responsibility. So in Syria, we've seen improvised weapons such as barrel bombs that were dropped on areas populated by civilians. And these are inherently indiscriminate weapons, making their use a war crime. So Assad long denied their use, even stating to a reporter that he'd never heard of such weapons. And so SJAC conducted a thorough investigation, and we collected and analyzed over 10,000 videos showing the use of barrel bombs. And I think through this process, we showed that the weapons were used throughout the country and on hundreds of occasions. And this helps dispel a notion that such use was accidental or by rogue elements. And rather, it tends to show that there was an Assad government policy of utilizing such weapons. So that the use of this type of open source documentation helps to expose the systems of mistreatment and has minimal impact on survivors, I think. In fact, it helps buttress their claims. And so one final point I'd like to make is that artificial intelligence is a defense attorney's new best friend. Faced with any kind of evidence, be it video or photograph or a document, which tends to show the guilt of an accused person, an attorney can claim that it was a deep fake or a creation of AI. And I think this will be a consistent problem in war crimes trials of the present and future. So in order to combat this, good documentation practices, including chain of custody, will be helpful here. Credible testimony from witnesses will also be necessary, particularly to authenticate other types of evidence. So a video depicting a war crime is good evidence. When there's a witness with personal knowledge of the same event who can say that the video is in fact real, the evidence is still stronger. So despite the development of new technology, these factors will remain the same.
Thank you so much, Roger. Just to quickly conclude this first section, and we are going to go into break in a minute. We heard some highlights from our panelists on their experiences on the importance of engaging with communities in the documentation efforts, safeguards and information, ensuring the safety of persons who are collecting information, ensuring informed consent, and good preparation for the documentation efforts, and also the risks of re-traumatizing the victims. We will now have a 5-minute break, and after this, we will return into the second section. And after that, I'm going to take questions from the floor. But please, again, feel free to already send them in the chat, and we will collect them in the Q&A. So we will now have a 5-minute break, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Hi everyone, welcome back. We are going to restart. So I see our panelists back with us. So I will now go into the second question, which may have a little bit of an overlap with of what we discussed in the first section. I would like to address to Mohammed, who I think we may have lost him temporarily. So I will go for now to Emma. So Emma, my second question is, so how does your organization apply a survivor-centered approach to documentation and accountability process in your work? And can you share some success stories and good practices?
Sure. But I already mentioned how the application works, but just sort of summarize. Again, the application helps documenters to better manage their own risk, even though, of course, documenting is never a risk-free activity. And some of the ways the Eyewitness app does that is by allowing people to work offline. So metadata will still be captured, even if your phone is, if you have it on airplane mode, because we capture metadata through 3 different sources, including GPS. The data the footage you capture is transmitted to the server in an encrypted manner. So if you're uploading something over the internet, a government who may be watching, for example, would see that you're sending an email and not, photos or videos. And again, the documenters don't need to keep potentially risky materials on their phone because we keep the original copy of the footage secured and then can send it back. And I think the other thing about the application itself is that because metadata is embedded in the footage automatically, documenters don't need to handle sensitive files individually or manually, which reduces opportunities for basically data breaches or surveillance that could endanger them. And the app has a few other built-in safety and security measures that I don't need to get into now, but could explain later. So that's, again, the technology of the application itself. But taking a step back from that, I think the key part of how we work is typically through working with local civil society organizations or NGOs or individuals who have established trust with the communities that they're actually embedded in or have been working with for a long time. And this really keeps the control over what to document, what to share, and when to share it with those closest to survivors' needs and safety considerations. And of course, many documenters will also be survivors themselves. So that's one aspect of it. The other is, as I said, we do a lot of training with organizations. And so part of that is on how to develop collection plans, assessing risk accordingly, and then meaningfully gathering informed consent. And in our experience, different groups use the application differently. So some documenters that we're working with currently handle their own data individually for their case, the case building that they're doing themselves. So they may be capturing a whole load of footage. We transferred back to them on an agreed upon basis, and then they just take that footage forward. In other cases, though, we do work with groups who may not have their own legal capacity, for example, or who may just, not have enough people to actually build cases or think through how to take a submission from the local level to the international level. And in those cases, we'll work with groups to develop submissions to different accountability mechanisms. And I think I saw in the chat a question about whether footage captured in the Eyewitness app could be used for a UN mechanism. Absolutely. And so I'll provide an example of that. But just to say kind of in general that we work with partners in these cases to analyze what information already exists, what you might need to document in addition to the evidence you've already gathered, and then what kind of justice pathways make the most sense and are priorities for the group based on what they've been able to collect. And so this really does ensure that survivors' goals shape documentation efforts. So in relation to the UN, for example, we've actually just recently made a submission with documenters in Nigeria. So a joint urgent appeal to 3 UN special rapporteurs in relation to ongoing violence in Nigeria's Middle Belt, the kind of middle region of Nigeria. And the submission details how armed attackers have killed civilians, destroyed property, crops, food reserves, and really affecting women and children. And that was based on an extensive amount of documentation carried out by people who live in the affected communities who have their phones and are basically acting as documenters on a regular basis. So I think since 2019, documenters in Nigeria have captured over 7,500 photos and videos, and those have fed into 2 submissions previously in 2020, 2022 and 2024, and then the one we just made. So as part of the process in this submission, for example, we ensured that survivors' identities were protected, that the information that they gathered through footage was contextualized appropriately and verified through open source where needed, and that their concerns about the kind of risks and timing of the submission were also taken into account, and that really shaped, where the submission went and how it was publicized. And maybe just in one other example, I think another important thing to keep in mind is that a survivor-centered approach when it comes to justice processes is that justice should be most accessible to survivors. I think one example that we often use of this in relation to eyewitnesses work was that footage captured with the app by an organization in the DRC was found admissible by a court in the DRC, so not internationally. And we worked with partners to help documenters capture footage well after the actual incidents had occurred. And those materials were then found admissible in the trial and helped convict 2 people for crimes against humanity. And 100 victims were found, party to the proceedings and received reparations. And I think for us, it's important that where possible, and of course, you can't always have a trial in the country where mass atrocities have occurred, but in this case, survivors could access justice in a context and a language they can understand, and you can better participate in those situations. And so I think we try to explore those avenues where possible. And I'll just close. The last thing is, I think when people use the application, we are able to provide affidavits to courts explaining the technology and how the footage can be shown to be authentic. I think sort of to your point, Roger, about the use of AI to generate, fake images, the eyewitness application where it's been used can basically help quash those concerns because you can really show how the technology works. So sometimes survivor-centered approaches end when evidence is gathered, but the way we try to work anyway is that approach should be embedded at all stages of the process, and it's kind of ongoing and iterative. So it's kind of a continuous process basically, and I think we're always open to ideas too about how that can work better. And so any feedback in the chat or in the question and answers would also be very welcome. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Please share any feedback or questions in the Q&A chat. The same question goes now to Mohammed. I hope, Mohammed, you can hear us. The same question is for Emma. How does your organization apply survivor-centered approach in your work? And can you share some success stories and good practices?
Thank you so much. Africa Center for Justice and Peace Studies has a long experience working with documentation. That is before working from exile, it was from Sudan. I think the main principles of the safety of the researchers and documenters, one of the major elements that pay attention for it through training, through giving them the main tools and don't harm. I think also one of the principles that help us a lot to document very success stories. And I think one of the stories that can be a model, just yesterday that the ICC sentenced Ali Kosheb to 20 years. Ali Kosheb is one of the Janjaweed leaders that committed atrocities in Darfur last 20 years. And this shows how much important that to keep the documentations and make it professionals also to compete with the international justice format, and more success stories that also we draw the attention of the world and about the sexual slavery and abductions in the current war through very high professional documentations, and then this it shows and help many other bodies actually, like the FFM fact-finding mission established by the Human Rights Council and fact-finding mission established by the African Commission for Human Rights and Human and People Rights. This is the contributions to what's been going on around Sudan, and how to keep the works of human rights, and especially the documentation that can fit for drawing the attention in advocacy and for the long term for the accountability. And this is what we are doing now in the such event like Al-Fashir. The event took place on the last week of October 2025. Al-Fashir is a town in North Darfur controlled by the Rapid Support Forces, and numbers of people were killed. An example, like one of the cases of documentations, what happened to the patients and the co-patients in one of the hospitals after the attack by the RSF to the town, which is numbers hundreds. Like I would say that at least 170 patients and co-patients were kept inside the hospital. So we use documentations because we have the medical personnel, we have some of the survivors, we have eyewitness, and we use open source such like satellite images. It shows that whether there is mass graves around and the layers of the ground that day by day, and how the square of the areas that are suspected to be mass graves. All this together, it gives complementary elements to paying as a result of having a protocol of professional and well documentation, and in Sudan, as I said before, that the human rights culture also spread widely across survivors because of the ongoing conflicts the last 20 years. So we have also ground base of auxiliary network and human rights defender widely everywhere, either inside Sudan, outside in the refugee areas, and the camps inside Sudan. Together, it helps us also to come out with a sort of human rights movement that have some skills, have some sort of attentions as advocacy for the international community, impacted on which level of documentation that needed, and I think such as events like the sentence of Ali Kosheb encourage the people and open hope that the value of the documentation it may end to justice. This is beside we have facing some difficulties as working from exile, so we have to function from remote. This is put another layer of responsibility of accumulated with the shutdown of the internet, that to be careful and have some protocol of communications. The times that of communicating, sending the information, meeting with the people, and having next of kin in case of emergencies, and also having communication with service providers to the human rights defenders set up in place to make the situation move smoothly, and at least that to manage the risk and mitigate the risk as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, and yeah, thank you for highlighting. I think the documentation efforts in Sudan really highlight the risks that human rights defenders face while doing documentation, and survivors as well. I will now address the question to Roger. And this is going to be the last question for the panelists, after which we'll turn to questions from the chat.
Thanks, Katya. So the main point I would like to make is that survivors should have agency in how their stories are told. So that process starts with informed consent, which I know is addressed in Redress's practice note. But at a minimum, it should include the purpose of the interview, what's involved, the benefits and risks of participating in an interview, the fact of confidentiality, and the right to end the interview at any time. The informed consent might also require notice of GDPR privacy rights standards. So, regulation in Europe that governs how private information should be retained, and the survivor should be informed about that in some cases. After the interview, the survivor should be regularly informed about the status of the investigations and accountability efforts. I think, Katya, you mentioned that these, accountability and justice efforts can take years to proceed. And so survivors are often left wondering, so why did I give that interview? What happens next? Particularly, months or years afterwards. So it's important to retain that communication. Um, in our case, when a witness interview is deemed relevant for an ongoing investigation, SJAC will first contact the witness to ask whether the survivor agrees to have their interview shared with the particular authorities in question. The initial informed consent is more general in nature. It says, I agree to have this information conveyed for justice purposes. But I think, because we didn't know at the time of taking the interview where it might be useful. Would it be through a UN entity? Would it be through a trial in Germany? Would it be in Syria, which is now looking like it'll be possible? So it's important to recontact the witness and obtain renewed informed consent. Another major concern for Syrians is their safety and that of their loved ones should they decide to testify before a tribunal. And so a number of Syrian cases are moving forward in European courts pursuant to universal jurisdiction. Many people on this webinar are probably familiar with it, but UJ provides a legal basis to prosecute crimes that occurred in another country. And so in the Syrian experience, many cases are moving forward in Germany, many in France or the Netherlands. SJAC has produced witness protection guides to inform witnesses of their legal rights and potential witness protection measures that are available in various states because the legal framework in each of these countries is different. And so we need to provide some information so the survivor retains agency and does not enter into these justice processes blindly. In some cases, we've even connected witnesses with a lawyer to represent them, and this ensures that they are fully informed of their rights and responsibilities. In some cases, they can testify anonymously. Those are rare cases, but at least there can be other protection measures afforded to survivors in some of these cases. And so all of these measures give agency to the survivor. I'll talk about one other program that SCHEC has co-developed with our partner, the Center for Victims of Torture, and it's called the Dual Referral Program. So CVT provides psychosocial support to victims of torture and other serious crimes in Syria and in the region. And SJAC's mission is mainly to support justice and accountability processes. So still, witnesses will often be in need of psychosocial support, and we will inform witnesses that they have an opportunity for that kind of support after we've conducted an interview and refer them to CVT. And, likewise, survivors seeking psychosocial support initially may have a desire to seek justice and to engage in accountability processes, either just out of their own volition or as part of their healing process. And for their part, then CBT informs the patients that they can be put in touch with a documenter from SJAC to share their story. And so this reciprocal relationship gives survivors a choice and helps to center them in the documentation process. And finally, I'll say that SJAC strives to elevate the voices of average Syrians on all of our platforms. And that's it's quite a challenging process, but recently we conducted a series of roundtables to collect the views of Syrians on accountability issues, specifically around the process to prosecute former ISIS fighters. Um, I think it's much easier for Syrians in the diaspora to have their voices heard, but for those within Syria, it's been traditionally quite challenging. So, we entered into, Northeast Syria or arranged different roundtables with them. And then while the names of the participants are kept confidential, we issued about a report about the overall trends and survey results. So we continue to work to understand survivors' views and to be a source of quality information. And, through that process, hope to elevate and center survivors.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you for highlighting some aspects of survivor-centered approach, in particular that the importance of the right to information, and that survivors need to have information about their rights in the documentation and then further accountability processes. And indeed, the practice note published by Redress contains quite detailed section on what informed consent entails, and how documents and initiatives should be seeking informed consent from survivors. So I really encourage everyone to have a look. We will now take questions from the audience, and we have a few questions in the chat. So I will read them, and then the panelists will have a chance to reply. I think we have two questions that are related to the Eyewitness app. And I think Emma addressed the first question, that is it possible to send documentation from Eyewitness app to the UN mechanisms? Another question is, are there safe applications for audio and oral documentation? And finally, the last question on the app is, are the certificates documented from the application are approved and taken before courts? So are they accepted in courts? And then we also have two questions. One, I believe, is related to what Roger mentioned on documenting intelligence documents, accessing documents. So the question is, how does information gathered from intelligence sources help to identify the perpetrators? And then the last question is related to documentation in Syria. And it's in fact a few questions. So how to continue to collect and document while being in Syria. A lot of documents are still not collected and analyzed. What about the new authorities facing the topic of justice and accountability? And can you also address the trial that took place in Aleppo a few weeks ago? So I'll stop here, and perhaps I'll give the floor to Emma first.
Sure. Thanks for the great questions. Maybe I'll start with the UN mechanisms one. I know I've touched on this a bit, but I mean, yes, absolutely. Anything gathered in the application and uploaded to the server could be used for kind of whatever accountability purpose you wanted. Just to say that this works usually in one of two ways. I know I mentioned this, but the first way would be that you might document. The footage would be uploaded, metadata secured in the chain of custody, preserved. And then we would just transfer back the footage to you. And the way a footage transfer normally works is we send the raw media a PDF that shows the metadata and any user notes that may have been captured with the footage, and then a spreadsheet of all of the footage with its metadata. And then you can use, as an organization or an individual could use that footage however you liked. So building that into your own submissions to the UN. Or in some cases, Eyewitness could support with that process as well. And then we could, have a conversation on what that submission might look like. In terms of applications for oral and audio documentation, so Eyewitness, I can really only speak to Eyewitness, but on the app, you can capture photos, videos, and audio files. So if you're in a situation where it's not safe enough to pull out your phone and actually be physically filming or photographing something, you can record what is, just a normal audio file, like a voice note that you might capture on your phone regularly. And this can also be uploaded to the server. There is in our application a video limit of 10 minutes, and this is for two reasons. One is when you're capturing video where metadata is embedded throughout the entire video, the file becomes quite large. And so a file that would be longer than 10 minutes would take potentially a long time to upload to the server, especially based on your internet connection. There's nothing stopping you from taking multiple longer videos. And we don't necessarily intend the application to be used to capture, multi-day witness statements. That's a sort of different process. So this is the use case for taking such long videos is not necessarily built into the application's design, but you can use it for oral and audio documentation for sure. And then the last question on certificates for the court. If I'm understanding, so this is a question about how the affidavit process works. In our experience, when the couple of cases that eyewitness footage has been used in actual trials, that footage has been admissible. And what we would do is, depending on how the case is being prepared and brought, we could prepare an affidavit that basically speaks to how the eyewitness technology works. So how the server is maintained, how when the footage is taken and then uploaded, the kind of method of encryption and hashing, which is how we ensure the chain of custody really hasn't been broken and that the photo hasn't been altered in since its capture. And that's sort of what the certificate I think you're referring to speaks to. And that, you could submit in addition to footage. So that has worked so far. But of course, different courts may treat evidence differently. So it hasn't been comprehensively tested in the various mechanisms.
Thank you, Emma. I'll give the floor to Roger to reply to the questions.
Thanks. Yeah, a number of really informed questions about Syria, so this is helpful. I guess the first I'll address is how do the intelligence services documents or the intelligence branch documents help to identify perpetrators? So they are rich with information, each of these documents, and we know this from evaluating the current set that we had and then another set that we obtained in 2014. To begin with, at the top, they have the headers indicating which branch information is coming from. Second, within the body, they will have orders often from the central, intelligence branch down to the local authority to tell them what to do. Put a stop to, protests, gather up, what they call terrorists, which could just be, protesters or average Syrians. And then at the bottom, there'll be a signature block. After that, and so that will indicate the name of a person or a title of someone who you can then cross-check with other information to see who the person was at that time. The document then is handed down through the chain of command, and signatures or annotations are made on the side of the document or at the bottom, indicating, okay, it is understood or do the necessary. So each of those signatures then becomes, creates a complicity or an involvement, a responsibility for that person who's ordering their subordinates to indeed take action. So this, helps to identify perpetrators through that process. What about the uncollected documents? And indeed, our 2 million documents is but a small number of those that exist. The one thing that I have seen in authoritarian regimes throughout the world is that they love paper. They love to record their wrongdoing in writing. I think that's because they cannot conceive of being held accountable. And number two, I think it's a necessary measure to ensure that their orders are complied with. And so we will always have paper, or so I have seen. And how, we currently don't have access to any further documents from Syria. There are these sort of windows of opportunity when we could go in and get it. And the new government now has control of those. They have said that they are in the process of analyzing them, and they have used them in a few situations, but I think they need expert assistance in how to catalog definitively those collections that exist. And we're hopeful that new mechanisms that they've set up will eventually lead to that. So in that regard, they've created a National Commission for Transitional Justice and a National Commission for Missing Persons. And we've seen a lot of work by the Missing Persons Commission in particular, trying to obtain international expertise. And we're hopeful that that will move forward. The Transitional Justice Commission, I think, is having a harder time getting started, but and in fact, their mandate is limited to Assad government crimes when there were many, many different perpetrators during the conflict. And so we've seen in a recent survey that was published in Foreign Affairs a few days ago that the Syrian people realize that there needs to be justice for more than just the Assad government folks. And so we're hopeful that there will be some measure of balance. The Aleppo trial is one example or test case for that. There was, post December 8th, and indeed around March of this year, there was a violence in the coastal regions where the Alawi, sect has a majority population, which was affiliated with the Assad government. And so, many conceived of those as reprisal killings for what Assad had done, and others said that there was a uprising that was coming to fight against the new Syrian government. And so indeed, there's a trial of 14 accused persons. 7 were affiliates of the new government, and 7 are affiliates of the old government, I guess, to put it simply. Um, and they tend to be low-level perpetrators. But I think it'll be a test case to see how honest the justice process will be. And indeed, SJAC will be uh, monitoring that trial as best as we can. We're trying to send folks there to observe the proceedings and to report on what would be happening. And our reports will be published at the link that I put below. Um, I can go on. There's a few more questions I'm happy to answer. Like there was one about GDPR compliance and what the regulations would require as far as informed consent. I think you should consult a lawyer, but I'm a lawyer, but not your lawyer. So, but in general, the survivor should be informed of the right to remove the stored private information from your database, wherever you're holding that. And they should be informed of the right to seek compliance with EU regulators. So there's some basic language that could be used and just added to your informed consent form in that regard. And there was another question, but I'm forgetting now.
I think just to read out the question, what would be the standards for an informed consent in terms of regulations? And yeah, Roger started replying to this, but yeah, just to say that it really depends on in which jurisdiction you are based. In general, in the EU, the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, governs informed consent. And we also mentioned this in our practice note. But yeah, if you look at the informed consent section in the practice note, you will also see that we speak about it from the lens of do no harm principle as well, and from the lens of survivor empowerment. Yeah, even though the key regulation is indeed GDPR. I don't know if yeah, Roger, please go
Sorry,
ahead.
there was one more point. There was a question about how to securely preserve voice notes and audio and something else. Maybe
Other safe applications for audio and oral documentation.
yeah, right. And so, I mean, our relational database we created, and I put a link here. I guess Grace can share it with everyone. Is called Bayonat, which just means the data in Arabic, and it allows folks to fully relate information to one another. It can be audio, it can be whatever. Of course, the underlying data needs to be held somewhere, and there are ways of creating fairly secure systems. We use some cloud-based systems to hold our data, but then, there's two-factor authentication, and then we limit the URLs that have access, so the locations from which you can access the data. And so, that's one place to look, and there are others that are available.
Thank you, Roger. I believe we don't have any more questions, so we can conclude the Q&A. Yeah, I would like to conclude this panel discussion and really thank you for the panelists who joined us, Emma, Mohammed, and Roger. I think we discussed many aspects of survivor-centered documentation today, really highlighting the challenges that documenting organizations and human rights defenders and survivors face in the process of documentation, but also sharing some lessons learned from this process and the success stories. I would like to invite you to join our next webinar under Redress Solidarity program that will happen in mid-February. And we will also be sharing a feedback form so you can share with us some of the topics that you would like to see in the next webinars. Thank you very much again for all who joined, and thank you the panelists, and thank you also the interpreters who